Hi everyone, Bill Rollins here. Not long ago I was on Ryan Byrne's YouTube channel. Now Ryan is a criminal lawyer from Mississippi, but I think he prefers the title criminal defense attorney. But Ryan has done a great deal of work on the D.B. Cooper case, looking through tens of thousands of pages of FBI documents. Okay, he's especially done some good work in the areas like the copycat hijackers and some of the stories that they have to tell. But Ryan still doesn't understand what transpired on the night of November 24th, 1971. So I need to create a few videos to go over some of the area that Ryan and I didn't get to cover. I was born and raised in Maine, and after high school attended the University of Maine, where I received a bachelor's and master's degree in mechanical engineering. While at the university, I joined the flying club, and by the time I completed school, I had my private pilot's license. About 10 years after college, I purchased this aircraft, a Beechcraft V-tail Bonanza. I would go on to get my instrument rating and log about 700 hours of flying time in this magnificent aircraft. Now back to the start of my career. After college, I accepted a job with General Electric as a field service engineer in their turbo machinery business. This cutaway is a view of one of GE's more successful gas turbines, the Frame 7 FA. But GE also manufactures steam turbines. This slide shows the low-pressure section of a steam turbine in a nuclear power plant. The part that is being lifted houses the stationary blades, often referred to as nozzles. These nozzles accelerate the steam to high velocity so that it can impinge on the rotating blades, creating mechanical energy. Throughout my career, I traveled to a number of countries such as Saudi Arabia, Algeria, Venezuela, Argentina, Australia, India, and others. This is one of my more interesting assignments, an oil platform in the North Sea. In addition, I worked in power plants, refineries, petrochemical facilities, and other process facilities. Later in my career, I was a consultant. As a consultant, I was hired as an expert witness on a trial where a steam turbine in an industrial facility had gone to destruction. After this disaster, the plant owner contacted his insurance company. Note that the turbine pictured here is not the one in question. The consultants for the insurance company determined that the reason for this failure was the end of the turbine shaft had severed off. Thus, a multi-million-dollar lawsuit was filed against the OEM, or original equipment manufacturer, not only for the cost of the new turbine, but also the lost revenue from suspended plant operations. This was a serious amount of money. I was hired by the law firm representing the OEM. So everyone involved in this lawsuit was focused on the severed shaft end. The plaintiff's consultants, both an engineer and a metallurgist, determined this failure was due to metal fatigue and asserted that the turbine was not properly designed. The metallurgist for the defense confirmed metal fatigue was the failure mechanism. Things didn't look well for the OEM. Now, metal fatigue is a phenomenon where metal can fail even though it hasn't reached its ultimate strength. So let's look at the FBI documents. Notice the two holes that are punched near the top of this page of paper. The holes are used with this type of folder, which has metal prongs to retain the pages. After repeated use, i.e. bending the prongs back and forth, these prongs can break. I refer to this as an example of low cycle fatigue. In machinery design, an engineer must be aware of fatigue limits, as machinery can experience millions of cycles, which can lead to high cycle fatigue. This was the insurance company's claim: improper design of the shaft end by the OEM. So now it was up to me to prove otherwise. So let me provide some background information. This picture illustrates a steam turbine rotor similar to the one in question. Note the thrust collar at the front end of the rotor. This collar is used to ensure that the rotor maintains its proper position in the turbine casing. A turbine of this size typically has two journal bearings that support the weight of the rotor. However, there needs to be a thrust bearing that maintains the axial position of the rotor so that it spins freely within its designated space. Steam forces within the turbine try to push this rotor to the exhaust end. As can be seen in this picture, a typical thrust bearing has a number of self-leveling pads. The collar on the rotor rides very close to this thrust bearing. However, when properly designed, the bearing cavity is flooded with lubricating oil so that there is no actual metal-to-metal contact between the thrust collar and the bearing. The collar rides on a thin wedge of lubricating oil. Embedded within the thrust pads are temperature elements that sense the temperature of bearing pads. Since this was back before data was collected electronically, I had piles of paper on my desk of the turbine's operating history for the prior year. But one document caught my attention. It was a letter to the plant owner from the OEM. In this letter, the OEM had responded to the plant owner's inquiry. Note that I will use nominal numbers for this discussion. The original machine rating was 20,000 horsepower. Upon conclusion of a study, the OEM offered the plant owner an upgrade to 25,000 horsepower. To safely operate at this new rating, 2 rows of blades needed replacement and a larger thrust bearing was required. For whatever reason, the plant owner didn't proceed with this upgrade. About 4 months prior to the turbine failure, as I examined the operating data, I discovered that the plant owner wasn't limiting his turbine output to its rating of 20,000 horsepower. In fact, he didn't even stop at the potential upgrade power of 25,000 horsepower. He was operating his machine near 30,000 horsepower, far beyond its rated capability. The thrust bearing temperatures noted in the records were high, but not at the alarm condition. However, 2 months later, these temperature elements were no longer reporting. Here was the first sign of trouble. The thrust bearing was severely overloaded, leading to metal-to-metal contact between the rotor collar and the bearing pads. The thrust bearing pads had eroded and wiped out the temperature elements. This wear was about 1/32 of an inch, or about 3/4 of a millimeter. The rotor was moving downstream. A few months later, continued wear caused the rotor to be about 1/16 of an inch from its normal operating position, and the tips of the turbine blades, spinning at 800 feet per second, or about 250 meters per second, began to make contact with the stationary components. This caused the rotor to vibrate, and the shaft end at the front of the rotor would have started wagging like a dog's tail, only it was wagging 6,000 times every minute. At this rate, it only takes a few hours of operation to reach 1 million cycles. This abnormal vibration is the mechanism that caused the fatigue failure of the shaft end. Thus, I issued my report, stating that operation far beyond rated capacity led to a thrust-bearing failure. All subsequent damage to the turbine, including the severing of the shaft end, was a result of these overloading conditions. As you can imagine, my report was quite damning. I made my travel arrangements to attend the trial, which was more than 1,000 miles from my office. However, 2 days prior to the trial, the defense attorney called me and told me to cancel my travel arrangements. The case had been settled out of court on terms that were very favorable for the OEM. So you may ask, why am I discussing this turbine failure? Because in the case of this turbine failure, everyone was focused on the severed shaft end, and it took a deeper investigation to discover the root cause of the problem. I have found with many problems, the way you need to solve it is to go in with an open mind. In the D.B. Cooper case, I see the same scenario, as everyone is focused on the money. However, a deeper investigation indicates Cooper didn't hijack Flight 305 all these years ago because he wanted money. But first, let's determine if the FBI conducted a thorough investigation. They looked at Boeing's employees, but found no one who matched. As we can see from this document, they had their agents go to all the major airlines looking for a disgruntled pilot. They had no success. Here's an FBI document from the director, yes, J. Edgar Hoover himself. He was gravely worried that this case was taking so long to solve. He knew there would be copycat hijackings, but he was also worried about the tarnished reputation that this case was giving the FBI. He wanted all West Coast offices to review their bank robbery suspects. Since this was only 3 or 4 weeks after the hijacking, what do you want to bet that ultimately the FBI reviewed bank robbery suspects from all across the country? So I want to expand upon the FBI's efforts. In Jeffrey Gray's book, Skyjack, on page 88, FBI Special Agent Ralph Himmelsbach states that the FBI expended tens of thousands of man-hours on the D.B. Cooper case. Now, I attended CooperCon in 2023, at which FBI Special Agent Larry Carr was a guest speaker. During the question and answer session, I mentioned Ralph's comment regarding tens of thousands of man-hours and asked Larry if he knew a more exact number. Larry replied that he didn't know the number, but mentioned that the amount of time to conduct just one interview could be extensive, including research, travel, the interview itself, and then transcription. So he certainly realized a great deal of time and resources had been dedicated to the D.B. Cooper case. Thus, I have tried to make an estimation of the time expended by the FBI on this case. As of May 2025, through the Freedom of Information Act, 106 installments of FBI documents have been released to the public. We now have more than 48,000 pages of documents. Several years ago, I had a conversation with Robert Rackstraw. Bob was a cordial fellow and told me he wasn't D.B. Cooper. But I believe Bob was a paralegal, and he had an acute knowledge of legal proceedings. He told me that there were about 80,000 documents from the D.B. Cooper case that would be released. So let's do the math. How much time does it take to generate one FBI document on average? As an example, I will look at the FBI interview with ticket agent Dennis Lisney, who sold Cooper his ticket. Here shown is the single-page interview, but this content is listed in the documents as D.B. Cooper 1676 to 1677. The unredacted copy shown here was obtained by Jeffrey Gray when he had access to the FBI files. Note that Lisney was interviewed by 2 FBI agents, probably at Portland International Airport. So between travel, questions and answers, transcription, etc., this interview probably consumed more than 2 man-hours. Since it consisted of 2 pages in the documents, a reasonable estimate of time would be something more than 1 man-hour per page of FBI documents. Thus, given 80,000 documents in the D.B. Cooper file, I estimate that the FBI has expended more than 100,000 man-hours on the D.B. Cooper case. Maybe I am being overzealous, but I believe that the FBI reviewed all of their records nationwide and probably scrutinized every man in the U.S. who had a criminal record. Yet they still couldn't find Cooper. What this tells me is that Cooper was a good citizen and not a man with a criminal record. Next, let's consider the forensic evidence from Cooper's tie. The citizen sleuths concluded that Cooper was an engineer type working in a unique manufacturing facility. What a revelation! So Cooper is professionally employed at a manufacturing facility. Again, this corroborates the fact that he doesn't have a criminal record, as he is a trusted member of his company's management team. He might even have the keys to open the shop in the morning. So my profile is that Cooper is an honest, everyday person working a job like most of us. Now, before I discuss Cooper's jump from the Boeing 727, there has been some discussion about whether or not Cooper could see the ground when he jumped. However, this document, DB Cooper 1820, along with Tina's testimony, provides the answer. About 7 nautical miles north of Amboy, Flight 305 was at 10,000 feet, flying in the clouds. They could not see the flashing lights from the radio tower in Kalama, and they reported being in the soup, which is a pilot term for no visibility. The plane was being flown via instruments. Now let's look at Cooper's jump. He is not a young man in peak physical condition, but a middle-aged man. This is not a jump from an airplane at 100 miles per hour, but a jump from a jet whistling along at 200 miles per hour. It's after dark, which greatly compromises the ability to see the ground and prepare for a safe parachute landing. On the ground, it's 42 degrees Fahrenheit and rainy. Flight 305 is immersed in the clouds, and the ground cannot be seen. Cooper is jumping blindly into the night sky. You have to ask yourself, what is going through this man's mind? This is suicidal. Why is an everyday man without a criminal record, who has a good-paying job, being driven to take on such a high-risk undertaking? It just doesn't make sense. However, in 2003, Tina shed some light on Cooper's situation. In a telephone conversation with Joe Weber, Tina tells Joe he was a very sad man. So now this begins to make sense. Something tragic has happened in this man's life, and he is so distraught, yet so angry, that he is of a frame of mind that is willing to accept this dangerous undertaking, something he would have never entertained prior to his tragedy. Many of us may be familiar with a movie made in the mid-70s called Death Wish, starring Charles Bronson. In this movie, a mild-mannered man loses his family as a result of violent hoodlums, so he obtains a gun and seeks justice vigilante style. This movie of vengeance must have resonated with the public, as 4 sequels to the movie were produced. I will discuss more about this movie later. But what about the money? Was it of prime importance to Cooper? I have read through the interviews with the 3 flight attendants, and I can't find anything that indicates Cooper was a greedy criminal. When the bag of money is brought on board and given to Cooper, Tina states that he made a cursory examination of the money and then stated that it looked okay. Wouldn't a greedy criminal count to make sure a bundle had $120 bills? Wouldn't a greedy criminal make sure the bundles all contained 20s and didn't have a 20 on top and bottom with $1 bills sandwiched in between? Wouldn't a greedy criminal count to make sure he had 100 bundles of cash? For a man thought to be intent on money, he has a very cavalier attitude about verifying the amount of money that he was given. Also, if he was intent on money, wouldn't he say something like, "Now I can buy the things I've always wanted"? Or perhaps, "This is just what I need to retire early"? But I can't find any passages in these interviews where he talks about his plans for the cash or how happy he is to receive it. In Seattle, after the money is brought on board and the passengers are exiting the aircraft, Tina says to Cooper, "Gee, there's a lot of money in that bag. Can I have some?" Cooper reaches in the bank bag and hands her a bundle of cash. This $2,000 packet in 1971 is equivalent to about $15,000 in 2025. But Tina has to backpedal and state that she cannot accept gratuities per company policy. At one point, Cooper is amazed at how much the bag of money weighs. He actually hands the bag to the flight attendants so they can see how heavy it is. Why would a greedy man allow others to hold his money? Cooper will go on to offer gratuities to all 3 flight attendants, but they all state that they can't accept money per company policy. Maybe I'm missing something, but I can't find any passages in the flight attendant interviews which indicate Cooper is mean, nasty, or focused on the money. So now I'd like to talk about interpreting the FBI interviews. For instance, the flight attendants sometimes have different answers regarding events that happened on the plane. This discussion revolves around the flight attendants, or stewardesses as they were referred to as back then, and their request to leave the plane. Tina, who was probably busy on the interphone, recalls that Flo came back to get her purse and then asked Cooper if the stewardesses could get off. Cooper replied, yes. However, Tina has her timing incorrect, as Flo had already asked to leave the plane, got the okay, and started to leave the plane. She then remembered her purse and returned to get it. It is likely that both Flo and Alice together asked Cooper if the stewardesses can leave the plane. Flo states that Cooper replies, sure, go ahead, but in a calm, uninterested manner. I believe Flo has correctly interpreted Cooper's attitude. But Alice seems to get the words right. She states that Cooper, when asked if the stewardesses can leave, replies, whatever you girls would like. So when I put these all together, I see that both Flo and Alice together ask Cooper if the stewardesses can leave the plane, and Cooper replies, whatever you girls would like, in a calm, uninterested manner. Now let's interpret the FBI documents in relation to the grudge. As can be seen, there are several FBI documents that state the reason for this hijacking was that Cooper had a grudge. In fact, several days after the hijacking, Tina is so concerned due to her emotional state on the night of the hijacking that she forgot to mention the grudge. She requests that she be interviewed again. Here is a brief excerpt from Tina's Philadelphia interview discussing the conversation regarding his grudge. Now, from what I can interpret from these documents, is that Tina and Cooper were sitting in the back of the plane, engaging in light conversation. Out of curiosity, Tina wants to know why, out of 1,000 flights per day, Cooper selected her flight to hijack. So she asks, why did you decide to hijack our airplane? With the emphasis on the word our. At first, not understanding the emphasis on the word our, he replies, I'm hijacking your airplane because I have a grudge to settle. Tina responds, oh, do you have a grudge against Northwest Airlines? Cooper laughs and replies, I don't have a grudge against your airlines. I just have a grudge. Then there is a pause, probably as Cooper reflects upon his grudge. I believe Cooper turns away from Tina and then states in a somber voice, your flight suited my time, place, and plans. And even Jeffrey Gray questions the motive. In his book Skyjack, Jeff wonders if the motive was only the money and states that according to Tina, Cooper was bitter. So, ladies and gentlemen, the evidence points to the fact that Cooper was a technical person, a geek, if you will. Like the cartoon character Dilbert, he was a man with the knack.
It's worse than I feared.
What is it?
I'm afraid your son has the knack.
The knack?
The knack. It's a rare condition characterized by an extreme intuition about all things mechanical and electrical, and utter social ineptitude.
Can he lead a normal life?
No. He'll be an engineer.
No!
There.
And when he looked across the aisle at Cooper, passenger Bill Mitchell didn't see a special forces guy, but a geeky man. And as Ralph Himmelsbach postulated, he was a middle-aged man who had nothing to lose. Obviously, to engage in such a risky undertaking, his grudge had to be extreme. So I began searching through the tragedies of the day, looking for a man with 3 attributes: military or aviation experience, a fit with a physical description, and a job where he wore a tie into a unique manufacturing facility. I looked at men related to the victims of the Kent State Massacre, but no one matched. I examined the passenger list for major airline crashes in 1971, looking at the fathers, brothers, husbands, and sons of the victims. I still couldn't find a match. I even began searching for fathers that lost a son in the Vietnam War. But one tragic event, just 51 days prior to the D.B. Cooper hijacking, caught my attention. As the headline reads, FBI bungles hijacking, 3 die. One of the deceased was a young woman who was a hostage on the aircraft. Her father, retired Army Major Joe Lockitch, was very vocal in the media about how the FBI made a gross error in the way they handled this hijacking. He would even state in public that the FBI has blood on its hands. I began to search for more information on Joe. But no matter what I did, I couldn't find a way to eliminate Joe. He was 1 in a trillion. I knew there would be no other man on the planet who could even come close to these odds. D.B. Cooper could be no one else. Another aspect of verification that we must consider is logic. If Cooper had a grudge to settle, who has been avenged? The FBI expended over 100,000 man-hours on this case, considered over 1,000 suspects, and spent untold millions of dollars trying to solve it. Joe certainly got his justice with the FBI. But at the end of the day, if Joe is D.B. Cooper, he must look like D.B. Cooper. When people who knew Joe look at the FBI sketch shown on the right side of this page, they say to me, "Boy, that FBI sketch sure looks like Joe." And when I line up Joe's face with this FBI sketch, the resemblance is astounding. This brings me back to the movie Death Wish, with its tagline, "How far would you go to protect your family?" There are a lot of similarities between Joe Lockitch and the main character in this movie, Paul Kersey. Both are mild-mannered men who are professionally employed. Each lost a loved one in their family by murder and have another who becomes psychologically affected. They take extraordinary risks to get justice. So, to understand D.B. Cooper, we need to look beyond the money and consider the emotions that it would take to push an honest, everyday, middle-aged man to attempt this desperate act. Joe Lockitch loved his daughter Susan more than he loved life itself, and he chose to hijack an aircraft not only to get retribution against the FBI, but also to garner a great deal of media attention. He wanted Susan to be remembered. Thus, this beautiful young woman and her needless death is the root cause for the D.B. Cooper hijacking.